Brother Terry had sent out an email this morning. Don't know if you got it or not, but the Christina, her father had passed away, and they was out in Amarillo taking care of that, and they're in need of some financial help. If anybody can help them in any way, just see either Jim, Terry, or me, and we'll take care of that, trying to get the money to them. In the way of announcements, we do need to remember that family over the loss of her father. On the sick list, Brother Terry said, I don't see him yet, but he said he hoped to see everybody here this morning. So, but we do need to keep him in our thoughts and prayers as he's going through his infusions. Hadn't talked to him in a couple of days as he's just rocking along. Never know from day to day whether he's going to have a good day or a bad day. So let's do keep him in our thoughts and prayers. The Fullers, Stablers, Tina. Talked to Jay this morning, and Holly is still having her issues, good days and bad, and mostly bad. So is there anyone else that we need to think about? We do need to keep the Wrights in our prayers also. They will be going to the Big Apple tomorrow. They've going to drive to Atlanta and then fly up so they can have a consult with a doctor to see about continuing to treat Lisa to do the procedures on her airway. And anything else? Brother Jeremy, would you lead us in a prayer then, please, before we begin class?
Let's pray. Father, thank you for the day and all for the opportunity we have now to come together to thank you for your work. We have fear, patience, hallelujah, and the blessings I have come to this day and know what this Lord is doing. Father, there are so many that are under the wheel. There is pain, one illness, death, hospital. Father, you know each case there is each individual case. There is always involved in that scientific treatment. Relief, pain, and deliver us the right spirit. May this be the time. All of these things, and well, we are Lord. Father, we pray your blessings on our congregation as we continue to live and grow. We are full of righteousness and help us to reach out to those around us, teach the people of God, but also to reach in for one another, comfort and faith, so early. And we thank you most of all for that.
Amen. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Brother Terry had wanted to get all the way through chapter 10 Wednesday night. He especially wanted to pause and talk about verse 25 some. But we're going to back up to 23 and start there, since that starts the paragraph. And basically everything from verse 23 through the end of the chapter, if you wanted to put it in a heading, you could call it, do all to the glory of God. Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Verse 23 says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edifieth not. Now, Andrea has a saying that I will probably mess up, but she's had it for a long, long time. But in essence, what she says is, just because you have the right to do something don't mean it's appropriate to do something. Or how do you phrase it? Is that close enough? Now I got her mind messed up. So. But what Paul is saying here is that, and by like I said, the chapter in context is, or the rest of this chapter in context is, that we do all to the glory of God. Something might be completely lawful, But if it causes another person to have questions or stumble, we need to think about it a little bit, because what we're trying to do is edify, which is build up each other, instead of saying, well, it's okay, I'm going to do it anyway type thing. Verse 24 says, let no man seek his own, but every man another man's wealth. What does the word wealth mean in this particular context here? I'm sorry? Well-being is literally, it could mean what another has, what somebody else has. So it's not necessarily money or a monetary thing, it's their well-being. So if we're to not seek our own, but that we're to put another man's before us, isn't that the same principle as taught throughout the New Testament with Christ? What did Christ always do? He humbled himself and was always the servant instead of the served. And I think that ties in with this right here. Brother Cox. Right. And he was self-sufficient anyway. He supported himself in his work. He didn't need it, but it would have been okay if he had. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, whether the theme, I guess, is you should do everything to win a brother instead of lose one.
That's correct. And in verse 25, as the one that Brother Terry had wanted to talk about, it says, whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Brother Terry walked in just a minute ago, and since you wanted to talk about this, you want to say anything before I start, or no? Okay. The word shambles here, what do we think of when we think of shamble? Poor side of town, the rundown place, etc. But what this word means is the place of provision or the marketplace. So whatever is sold in the marketplace is okay, because it then goes into ask no questions for conscience sake. Now, here we get into, and we'll pick up on this in some later verses, but right now I just want to give you a basic overview of what's going on here. Brother Luke just got back from Korea. I'd spent a year in Korea about 30 years ago. Brother Dave's been to Korea. When you go into the restaurants and you see something that's nice to eat, do you want to know where that food came from? You don't ask questions, do you? You eat it. If it's good, you eat it, and if it's not, you put it aside and try something different. So we had a preacher here many years ago that said he didn't like venison. And he got real sick, and just before he died, I called him up one day and said, if Andrea makes some chili, because he was Texas, he always wore his cowboy hat, and he loved chili. And I said, if Andrea makes some chili, can we just bring it over to your house? And you feel like that? And he said, yeah. So she cooked a big old pot of chili, and we took it over, and he started eating it and finished one bowl, which was kind of unusual because he was not in that good of health at that time. But he asked for some more, and I said, well, before we get you the second bowl, the meat in there is venison. And he thought about it for a second, and he said, I'll take another bowl. So, but if we had told him before he had taken that first bite, odds are he wouldn't have eaten. But after he ate it, it was good. So there's a lot of things. Now, again, where this is coming from as we go through the rest of this chapter, it's talking about meat that was offered to idols and things of that nature. And there's a separation here that takes place. If they visit somebody's house and they're served a meal, no questions asked, they eat it. My son has been to Europe a few times with school, and one of the things where they were is if somebody put something on the table, you dishonor them if you don't at least try it. And so here, but at the same time, if somebody takes you to a temple and they have offered that and you know that it was offered to an idol, then you're not to partake of it. So it sounds like you're picking at nits here, but where he says that if it's sold in the shambles or sold in the marketplace along with everything else, and you can't tell if this had been offered to idol or this had not, there is no difference between them. But if you know that this part has been offered to an idol, you are not to partake of it. Does that make any sense? And why would that distinction be that way? Why is it okay if it is bought in the general marketplace and you don't know where it comes from versus taking it when you know where it comes from? What's the difference between the two? Not be a stumbling block to a weaker person, and also you're not wanting to endorse somebody else. And if we take that down to today's application, Brother Henderson has to go to work this afternoon. Years and years ago, when I was growing up, there was the blue law. Certain work did not take place on Sunday. And people were frowned on if they did any work on Sunday. Culture has changed. In this setting here, the culture was that idols, even pagan idols, things were offered to them. So you had to draw that distinction. Today, there's not near about the distinction. Today, in essence, there is more distinction than 10 years ago. Because people now are wanting to buy USA stuff and not stuff that was made in China or stuff that was made outside the United States. Does that mean that if and years and years ago, when people would buy foreign-made cars versus US-made cars, now it's been about 30-odd years ago, I had a little issue with that, but then at the same time, I said, well, it's my money. I can spend it the way I want to. If this car gives me a better value than this car, why should I buy this one just because it's made in a certain location? So you can take all of that down to it where it says, don't ask some questions. In verse 26, it says, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If somebody would go back to Psalms 24 and verse 1, this is where this saying comes from, and it adds a little bit more to it in Psalms 24. And they that dwell within is added to it. So if we were to use Psalms 24 in place of verse 26 here, the earth is the Lord's, the fullness is the Lord's, and everything that is in it is the Lord's. All we that dwell in it belong to the Lord. So going back to what I said was the general theme of the rest of this chapter, everything that we do needs to be done to the glory of God, because everything here belongs to Him anyway. Verse 27 then says, if any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no questions for conscience sake. But if any man, and this would be another guest and not the one that invited, but if any man say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty? Well, let me just pause and not do that one. If we just look at verse 27 and 28, it's what we've already said. If someone tells you that, and then here it adds to it and says that even though it's okay to eat, if somebody brought it to our attention, we're not not for our sake, because it's still lawful, but for his sake. He's the one that said that was given to a night, served, offered to a night. Yes, sir.
Obviously, this passage is talking about trying not to offend somebody or your influence the people who are not in the church and can be applied to you for pleasure. But at what point do you draw the line? And this is where people that are offended or whatever word you want to use, that this is about everything. If this is just talking about me, instead of giving me, that's bad. Where do you draw the line about offending?
Well, to me, in context here, what it is talking about is the brotherhood. People within the church, we're to try to edify each other in the church, and we're more concerned with our own than with the outside when it comes to that. But we do need to do things to try to influence people positively on the outside. But where you draw the line is that you will not do anything that against God's law to make somebody happy. That's the hard line that you cross or don't cross. But on the other hand, there is some subjectivity to it, and just where you draw the line would have to be an individual matter. For instance, several years ago at this congregation, there was a person, they're no longer here, but they frowned on people that went to Ruby Tuesday or someplace like that to eat a meal because they served alcoholic beverage at that location. Like I say, that was many, many years ago. Today, you almost cannot go to a restaurant that doesn't serve it. So where do you draw the line? You try to use that opportunity to teach, but I would go ahead and go eat.
Well, I think I can understand you too. But how does that balance with this principle? Because it obviously things that your influence that individual, not saying do it. And that's what's talking about avoiding.
That's where let's pick up with the verse 29 that I didn't complete, because that builds right into where we are. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? And this is just what we're talking about here. If I choose to do something that is legal, that this person doesn't like, should I bow to his conscience, or why should I allow his conscience to rule over me? That's what verse 29 says, which is just what you said. And Paul says, for if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that which I give thanks? Whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Now, what we're talking about is restaurants that serve alcohol doesn't exactly fit in that category. But if you have opportunity to teach someone and they absolutely will not listen to you. And at the same time, what you're doing is, by all definitions in Scripture, legal, authorized, and what you're doing is not detracting from the glory of God. There are certain people in this world, and I might be one of them because I'm an old mossback, who are just outright stubborn and bullheaded and will not. My dad has a saying about some people. He said, son, don't waste your time talking to them. Their mind's made up. Don't confuse them with the facts. So, but if you take time to try to explain to somebody, try to talk to somebody, use the Bible for reasoning, and they will not accept what's written, then personally, I think you have no, you don't have a choice in the matter. You just have to, you either have to be their doormat, or you have to be a Christian and do what's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now there are. I had mentioned the word eat, but there are a whole host of things that could fall in this category, and some you can give up and not do if it's going to help that person. So, but then there comes a time where you make the decision. Mm-hmm. Well, verse 32 comes into it also. It says, give none offense neither to the Jew nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God. So he divided it in three categories there: Jews, Gentiles, and Christians. And we know that there were Jews that were Christians and Gentiles that were Christians. So, but that help answer your question? Not really. It says, verse 33, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. The whole, yeah. Yep. When I was in the military, I don't know how they do it these days, but when I was in, we were taught that you don't dishonor your unit, you don't dishonor the service, and you don't dishonor your country. Here as Christians, we don't do anything that dishonors Christ or our congregation. We try to do that. But at the same time, do you recall the passage where they were instructed to go to a city, but if they wouldn't be received, to shake the dust off and leave? Isn't that basically the same principle? If you can't talk to them and get them to understand, you're to move on. Not forget them, because there might be an opportunity to go back later, but you're to move on. Pray that seed takes hold. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think the last verse of that chapter summed it up when he said, as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of others, that they may be saved. Paul had the attitude that he was going to do everything possible. He would humble himself, he would serve others, he would do for others that they may be saved. And here's where I think that the scriptures were divided badly. Man divided them. Personally, I think that the first verse of the next chapter should have gone with chapter 10, and then we start with verse 2, because verse 1 says, follows on the heels of what he said that he did, that all might be saved. And then he follows it up with, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. So if we put Christ first in our life, there used to be a book out many years ago called WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? So I think if we come to one of these situations, if we would just stop and pause for a minute and said, well, if Jesus was in my place right now, what would he do? And if we then followed that guidelines, I think we could do the right thing. Questions or comments then on chapter 10?
That we have so many different religions, right? We have the Hindus, and they offer their food to idols and stuff. But everyone cooks the same kind of dishes. If you go to a Christian's house and eat food that Hindus would normally eat, so the food is not the problem. But when you know that the food, like say you go to a Hindu house, you know the food is offered to an idol, then as a Christian, you shouldn't eat it because, everything is God and so everything is good to eat, but you're trying not to wound the conscience of another Christian. You're trying to do everything to win a brother, So that's where it comes in. And we had to deal with that a lot in Trinidad because of the different cultures. It's a multi-cultural, multi-ethnic society.
It all boils down to, if you just take that whole section, it all boils down to one thing. It's not what it is, it's the attitude. Okay. Chapter 11 is divided into two sections. The first half of it basically deals with head coverings, and the second deals with the Lord's Supper. And I find that the first half is head coverings is, well, I just enjoy the section because it gets into, I can go back and get into a little history and things of that nature. But let's just start. It says, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. So, Paul is very good at always giving praise. When he writes letters, he's always praising people for their steadfastness and what they do. And here he's, in essence, pleading to them that they remember him, but most importantly, that they keep the ordinances as he delivered them. It's not his ordinances, it's the ordinances that he delivered. Where did the ordinances come from that he delivered? They come from God. So he's telling them because that follows up with what verse 1 said, that he follows Christ. Be ye followers of me as I follow Christ. And now he's saying, if you do these ordinances, you are staying in step with Christ. Verse 3 says, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Head there just means master or the chief or the ruler, and as soon as I say that, the culture that we're in today, there are many people that would like to take the penknife and cut this section out of the Bible because they think that if we follow this as written, that we are being derogatory toward certain people. In any organization, there is an organizational structure. If you're not independently wealthy and work for yourself and set the rules, you work for somebody. Even people that are independently wealthy, they still, in some cases, follow the rules of somebody. Brother Golden has a pharmacy. He is a pharmacist. He cannot do anything he wants to do because the federal government would come in and shut him down if he didn't follow certain rules. So we have to look at the organizational structure and not gender when we start talking about this subject. Goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. Who was the first one created? Adam. Man was created first. Where did woman come from? Adam. So there's a hierarchy there. Does that mean that it is unequal? Absolutely not. But it just shows that there's an organizational structure. Verse 4 says, every man praying or prophesying have his head covered dishonors his head. Dishonoreth the head. Well, the head is Christ. So years ago, and this is, culturally, we have come a long way in the United States. A lot of things for good and a lot of things for bad. I recall when I was a youngster that when men wore hats or caps, when they entered a building, it come off the head. When they met a lady on the street, they tipped the hat. Not necessarily take it all the way off, but they in essence made a motion that they were tipping their hat or taking their hat off. And why was that? It was to give honor to, respect to. Today, you walk around in stores and you see nobody bothers to take a hat off. Nobody bothers to acknowledge somebody else. I personally have never been fussed at for doing it, but I know of people that have been fussed at for holding doors open for people. Now, I guarantee you, I don't care who you are in here or outside world, if I walk through a door and I catch in peripheral vision somebody that's going to come in that door after me, I don't care if it's man, woman, cat, or dog. If they're authorized, I'll hold the door open. If I get fussed at, I get fussed at. But can you just see somebody holding the door open for a woman and then slamming it in front of a man? It just don't work that way. I forget the exact circumstance, but on TV the other day, there were some people that went to Auburn, and it was like midnight when they was on the street walking around, and they made comment that there was no traffic on the street, and they saw somebody standing at the intersection waiting on the light to change. And they had to make comment about how respectful, they didn't use that word, but how respectful that person was for waiting for the light to change at midnight with no traffic on the road. Why did that make such a big deal or big impression on that person? It was because they was from a location where people jaywalked all the time and people did not have respect for law or authority. So it made an impression that, hey, down in the South, those folks are, or at least at this location, they're decent and respectful. So we also get into the history part of this as where the big surge came on dishonoring that way started in the 1960s with the people that were against the Vietnam War, and we called them hippies back in those days. Matter of fact, sometimes we called them the long-haired hippie freaks because they would wear long hair. Now, the reason we said that, and this is not from my perspective, it's from their perspective, and I forget who it was that wrote about it, but they said that the people who were wearing the long hair, that was an instant show of their disrespect for authority. So it started back then, but today, if men have long hair, women have short hair. We'll get into the women just a little bit later, because it talks about if a woman is uncovered, it dishonors the woman, but if the man is covered, it dishonors the man. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But if we want to just pull it down into and explain it as succinctly as we can, today, why should women have hairstyles different than men? And I didn't say anything about length. I said, why should women have hairstyles different than men, or men different than women? To show the distinction between man and woman. Because if you look back at history, when Jesus was walking this earth, did he wear pants? He wore the same type garment as the women wore. The robes, the full-length garments. But they decorated them different, and there was a different cut, and they could tell the difference between a man and a woman, even though they wore the same type clothes. Today, Andrea and I have been watching one of her favorite shows on TV, Jeopardy, and somebody be up there, and we would have a discussion. Is that a man or is that a woman? Even after they started talking, we didn't know. There was one in particular that she not only had short hair, and again, I'd mentioned nothing about length. I'm talking styles. But her style was, well, I don't see anybody in here with that particular style right now, but it was almost a high and tied. If for those military, they understand what I'm talking about. It was real close cut on the sides, and then there was a part in it and a little comb over. For all the world, it looked like the hairstyles of the men back in the 1950s. And she had on a suit with a tie. Is that an appropriate dress for a woman? In the cultural world today it is, but under God's rules here, there's supposed to be a distinction between men and women. And I'm sorry, you could draw it, yeah. You could definitely make some, I got to hurry, Luke just stood up. Every man praying, okay, verse 5, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. Now, there are some women today that have shaven their heads for a medical reason. Now, you have to understand when we're talking about this, we talk about things in general. Women need to look like women, men need to look like men. There are circumstances where if someone has cancer, they lose their hair, etc. That's one of the exceptions that nobody should frown at or point at. That just happened. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Or dress like. and a lot of them even have the scars that they'll wear just to cover. Not necessary, but yeah, they're not trying to look like something they're not supposed to be. Verse 6, for if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shaven or shorn, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. Again, that does not mean that you are unequally yoked. A man and a woman are equal. There is just a pecking order or an organizational structure that is being looked at. Woman was made to be a helpmate for man. Man was made in the image of God. Man is to put women on pedestals. We are to honor women. So let's not get off on that wrong road. Brother Golden. Right, absolutely. So I'm going to skip down to verse 16 that closes this out, since I don't have much time left on this section. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. And this whole thing deals with dress and appearance and all. And he is trying to cover some stuff that happened in the Old Testament, how certain laws were. But one of the things that you need to consider also when it's talking about the women here is there's another section in Scripture that says you're not to be braided hair and all the ornaments and everything like that. Well, why is that? And that goes back to what did the harlot dress like and look like back in the old days. So the whole impression here that you get from this first 16 verses is that if women put God first and want to live and obey Christ, they are wanting to do honor to Christ, to God, and that they're not going to go out in public dressed like a harlot, that they're not going to go out dressed uncomely or unseemly or whatever word you want to use on it. Men need to be respectful, so do women. A woman today can either be underdressed or overdressed. A man can be underdressed or overdressed. So to me, they're all on the same plane. It's just that we've each got distinct roles or positions that we need to carry out, but at the same time, we need to edify and build up one another. Questions or comments on this section? Yes, sir.
One thing that they referred to back in this time, particularly Parliament, the temple that priests and ladies that had short hair,
Yeah.
they didn't want to
Right. And each custom throughout the centuries have had different rules and regulations. In the East and the Far East and Middle East, some women had to wear headscarves, some had to wear veils, depending on age, depending on being at home or out in public would be how dressed or they happen to be. And even today, there in that part of the world, not the Christians, but different religious groups, if women are out in public and are uncovered, they get severely punished for it. So in one respect, you have to look at and understand culture. But when this last verse here says, if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom. We have neither the churches of God. So does that mean that a church congregation in the state of Florida, that it would be okay for women to come to worship service in bikinis? Better be shaking your head this way. Pardon? Yeah, because of culture. But regardless of where in the world you are, would somebody be putting God first and honoring Christ if they came in that manner of undress? Absolutely not. It all goes back to that heading, do all to the glory of God. Thank y'all so much for your attention and your comments.